If two outboard engines make the same horsepower, why can one cost under $1,000 while another pushes 20 grand? Are you paying for build quality, reliability, brand confidence, or just the name on the cowling? In this video, we're ranking 21 outboard engine brands from the cheapest to the most expensive, using real-world pricing at comparable horsepower. And to understand how that gap gets so extreme, we have to start at the very bottom of the ladder, with the engine built for one purpose only: be as cheap as possible. Let's start at the absolute bottom of the price ladder. If you've ever searched for the cheapest petrol outboard online, chances are you've already seen Hangkai, probably before you even finished typing 15 HP. A Hangkai 15 HP two-stroke often shows up around 800 to 1100 USD, which immediately raises the obvious question: what's the catch? The answer is simple: basic casting, minimal corrosion protection, and quality control that can feel like a lottery. Some owners get a decent runner, others get a weekend project. That said, these engines do move boats. For inflatables, tenders, or emergency backup use, they've earned a strange reputation as the outboard equivalent of a disposable lighter, cheap, simple, and not meant to be cherished. So ask yourself, do you want an engine, or do you want a learning experience? And once you step slightly above rock bottom pricing, the next brand shows what cheap but more structured looks like. Laogen sits just above Hangkai, and you can feel the difference immediately. Not because it's refined, but because it's trying to be. A Laogen 15 horsepower typically lands around $1,200 to $1,500 US, and at that price point, expectations start to change. Here's the question for you: how much more confidence do you expect for a few $100s? With Laogen, you usually get slightly better castings, more consistent assembly, and engines that don't feel quite as roll the dice. They're still basic, but they're less chaotic. Real-world anecdotes often sound similar. Starts fine, runs fine, but don't expect it to age gracefully in salt water. Think of Laogen like a budget power tool. It works, just don't drop it. You're still buying cheap horsepower, not longevity. And when you add just a bit more money again, the next brand shows how budget engines start pretending to be mainstream. Sail is where things get interesting. At around $1,600 to $1,900 US for a 15 horsepower, this is often the first brand where buyers stop asking, will it run, and start asking, could I actually live with this? Sail outboards usually feel more complete, better finishes, more consistent idle, and fewer horror stories out of the box. They're still budget engines, but they're aiming at first-time owners who don't want constant tinkering. So here's the real question: is this the cheapest engine you trust on a long day out? For some people, yes. For others, it's still a stepping stone. Think of Sail like an entry-level commuter car. Not exciting, not premium, but finally starting to feel like transportation, not an experiment. And once you cross this line, the next brands begin blurring the gap between budget and genuinely usable ownership. Cal and Gloria usually sits in that awkward space where the price is still low, but expectations suddenly jump. A 15 HP Cal and Gloria often comes in around $1,700 to $2,000 US, which is enough money for buyers to start asking serious questions. Here's the big one: does it feel like a toy, or does it feel like an engine? Cal and Gloria tries hard to land on the right side of that line. Fit and finish are noticeably better than the very cheapest brands, and first start reliability is generally more consistent. Owners often say it actually fired up like a normal outboard, which tells you a lot. That said, long-term saltwater use still exposes thin coatings and average hardware. Think of Cal and Gloria like a budget smartphone, impressive out of the box, but you don't expect it to look new in 2 years. And once buyers want even more reassurance, the next brand steps in with a clearer push toward reliability. Seanovo has spent years trying to shake the cheap and risky label, and at $2,000 to $2,400 US for a 15 HP, it's clear they're aiming higher. This is often the first brand where buyers start saying, I'd actually rely on this. Ask yourself this: would you take it farther from shore than you planned? Many Seanovo owners do, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. Assembly quality is more consistent, vibration is lower, and cold starts are less dramatic than early budget brands. Are they perfect? No. Corrosion protection still needs help, and long-term durability isn't in Japanese territory, but the step up is real. Think of Seanovo like a no-frills commuter bike. Not exciting, but dependable enough that you stop thinking about it mid-ride. And once you're willing to pay a little more again, the next brand introduces an interesting twist. Mikatsu is interesting because it doesn't feel like a typical budget brand. Priced around $2,400 to $2,800 for a 15 horsepower, it often markets itself as a Korean-engineered alternative, which immediately raises eyebrows. So here's the question: does branding change reality? In practice, Mikatsu engines tend to feel better sorted than many cheaper competitors. Throttle response is smoother, noise levels are lower, and early ownership complaints are less common. That said, the underlying manufacturing still shares similarities with Chinese production. Parts availability and dealer support vary by region, which can matter more than the engine itself. Think of Mikatsu like a car with a fancy badge on a shared platform. It works well, you just need to know what you're really buying. And after this point, the list starts crossing from budget experiments into recognizable mainstream brands. Parsun is where a lot of people stop calling it a gamble and start calling it a plan. A Parsun 15 HP usually lands around $2,600 to $3,100 and at that price you can feel the extra structure. Assembly is more consistent, vibration is lower, and out-of-the-box issues are less common than earlier budget brands. Here's the question for you: if an engine starts every time and runs smoothly, how much does the badge really matter? Parsun leans into that exact thought. It's still budget-minded, but it no longer feels disposable. Real-world stories often sound like this: bought cheap, expected trouble, didn't get it. Corrosion protection still isn't class-leading, but for inland or mixed-use, owners are often pleasantly surprised. Think of Parsun like a store-brand appliance that actually lasts longer than expected, and once buyers want similar pricing with a slightly different philosophy, the next brand steps in. Hidea often sits shoulder to shoulder with Parsun on price, with a 15 HP Hidea typically priced around $2,800 to $3,300. The difference is tone. Hidea markets confidence more aggressively, and in many cases it earns it. Ask yourself this: would you trust it on a full day out, not just a short run? Many Hidea owners do. Throttle response is smoother than early budget brands, cold starts are predictable, and the engines generally feel less stressed under load. Long-term saltwater use still demands care, and dealer coverage varies by country, but outright horror stories are far rarer than people expect. Think of Hidea like a budget airline that's quietly cleaned up its act. Still not luxury, but no longer something you apologize for. And once pricing crosses into European branding and expectations, the list takes an interesting turn. Orca is interesting because it feels European, even though much of its manufacturing is outsourced. A 15 HP Orca commonly sits around $3,300 to $3,800, which immediately raises expectations. So here's the question: are you paying for the engine, or for the reassurance of buying local? Orca leans heavily on the second part. Fit and finish are generally better than budget Chinese brands, and customer support in the UK and EU is a big selling point. On the water, performance is respectable rather than exciting. Reliability is usually solid, but long-term durability still depends heavily on maintenance. Think of Orca as a white label product with a strong warranty and a local phone number, and for some buyers, that's exactly the point. And from here on, the gap between budget and established brands really starts to close. Selva is where buyers often pause and say, okay, this feels like a real step up. A Selva 15 horsepower usually lands around $3,800 to $4,400, and at this point you're no longer buying cheap power, you're buying European engineering philosophy. Here's the question: does refinement matter to you as much as raw reliability? Selva engines tend to feel smoother and better finish than most budget brands. Controls feel more precise, noise levels are lower, and the overall experience feels more considered. That said, Selva ownership can be regional. In Europe, support is strong. Outside it, parts availability can be slower. Think of Selva like an Italian scooter. Stylish, well-engineered, but happiest close to home. You're paying more now for feel and finish, and once European flair gives way to global brand backing, the next name should sound very familiar. Mariner sits in a strange but reassuring place. A Mariner 15 HP usually falls around 4,200 to 4,800 USD, and many buyers quickly realize something. This engine feels familiar. That's because Mariner is closely tied to Mercury, sharing technology, components, and manufacturing. So let me ask you, if it feels like a Mercury, runs like a Mercury, and is serviced like a Mercury, does the badge matter? For many owners, Mariner is a quieter way into a well-supported ecosystem. Reliability is strong, dealer networks are wide, and servicing is straightforward. You're not buying excitement, you're buying predictability. Think of Mariner like buying the same car with a different trim badge. Less flash, same bones. And once you move past this point, the list reaches one of the most respected names in small outboards worldwide. Tohatsu is often the point where skeptical buyers relax. The Tohatsu 15 horsepower typically sits around 4,800 to 5,300 USD, and suddenly the conversation shifts from "is it okay" to "how long will this last?" Ask yourself this: do you want an engine that impresses, or one that quietly does its job for years? Tohatsu leans hard toward the second answer. These engines are known for simple, robust design, easy maintenance, and excellent longevity. They're not flashy, noise levels are average, styling is conservative, and performance is honest rather than exciting. But breakdown stories are rare. Think of Tohatsu like a well-worn tool that always works when you grab it, and once you step beyond this reliability-focused tier, you enter the true heavyweight brands. So now we know that 15 horsepower is about access, so that means 50 horsepower is about commitment. This is where engines stop being accessories and start becoming serious investments, and where the cheap to expensive ladder looks very different. So let's start with our first brand on this list. Parsun at 50 horsepower is where things get genuinely interesting. A Parsun 50 horsepower EFI usually lands around 6,500 to 7,500 USD, which is dramatically cheaper than the big Japanese brands, and at this level that difference really matters. Here's the question for you: would you trust a budget brand when the engine is no longer small and forgiving? Many owners do, especially on aluminium fishing boats and basic runabouts. Parsun's 50 feels solid, delivers usable torque, and does the job without pretending to be premium. That said, finish and refinement still lag behind. Noise levels are higher, and corrosion protection needs attention if you're in saltwater. Think of it like a base model pickup. It hauls, but you hear and feel everything. You're buying access to real power at a low price, and when buyers want similar pricing with a bit more polish, the next brand steps in. Hidea's 50 horsepower EFI typically sits around 7,500 to 8,500 USD, and that extra money buys you something noticeable: confidence. Compared to Parsun, Hidea's 50 feels calmer under load, smoother through the rev range, and slightly better finished overall. Ask yourself this: if you're running family, friends, or longer trips, does that extra reassurance matter? For many buyers, it does. Hidea engines at this size feel less strained, and early owner feedback is generally more positive than people expect. They're still not premium, dealer coverage varies, and long-term saltwater use demands care, but the gap between budget gamble and usable ownership narrows significantly here. Think of Hidea like the higher trim of the same truck. Same job, fewer complaints. And once European engineering enters the 50 horsepower conversation, the tone shifts again. Selva's 50 horsepower class usually lands around 9,500 to 11,000 USD, and this is where the ladder starts feeling grown up. At this price, buyers stop comparing cheap versus expensive and start comparing experience. So here's the question: do you want raw power or do you want refinement while using it? Selva engines tend to feel smoother, quieter, and better finish than budget competitors. Controls are more precise, vibration is lower, and overall behavior feels composed. Support is strongest in Europe, where Selva's reputation carries real weight. Outside that, parts and service can be slower, something buyers need to factor in. Think of Selva like a European hatchback with a good engine. Not flashy, but clearly engineered with intent. And from here on, the remaining brands define what expensive really means at 50 horsepower. This is where a lot of buyers suddenly stop scrolling. A Tohatsu 50 horsepower typically lands around 10,500 to 12,000 USD, and for many people it feels like the sweet spot between value and trust. Here's the question: do you actually need the biggest badge? Or do you just want Japanese reliability without the premium tax? Tohatsu delivers exactly that. The engine feels solid, torque is usable across the mid-range, and nothing about it feels rushed or fragile. Owners often describe Tohatsu 50s as quietly tough. They're not the smoothest, and they won't win beauty contests, but they just keep going. Maintenance is simple, parts are accessible, and breakdown stories are rare. Think of Tohatsu like a plain steel hammer. Not pretty, but you trust it. And when refinement starts to matter more than raw toughness, the next brand raises the bar. Suzuki's 50 horsepower usually sits around 12,000 to 13,500 USD, and this is where engines start to feel genuinely enjoyable. Compared to Tohatsu, Suzuki feels livelier. Quicker throttle response, stronger mid-range punch, and a lighter overall feel. Let me ask you this: do you want an engine that works, or one that makes the boat feel more alive? Suzuki clearly aims for the second. These engines are popular on aluminium fishing boats and small runabouts for exactly that reason. Fuel efficiency is generally strong, but if you enjoy that punchy throttle too often, you'll notice it at the pump. Reliability is solid, though Suzuki rewards owners who stick to service schedules. Think of Suzuki like a sportier trim level. Same job, more smiles. And when smoothness and long-haul comfort become the priority, the next brand takes the lead. Honda's 50 HP typically lands around 13,000 to 14,500 USD, and at this level buyers are paying for composure. Honda engines don't rush, don't surge, and don't feel stressed, even when pushed. Here's the real question: how often are you actually running wide open versus cruising for an hour? Honda is built for the second scenario. The engine holds plane comfortably, runs quietly, and feels mechanically relaxed under load. Acceleration is smooth rather than exciting, and yes, weight is higher than some rivals, but that weight brings stability, especially in chop. Owners who cruise long distances tend to appreciate this more than outright speed. Think of Honda like a long-distance cruiser, not thrilling, but endlessly reassuring. And once price climbs further, the final brands define the true top end of the ladder. Yamaha's 50 HP usually sits around 14,500 to 16,000 US dollars, and for many buyers, this is the moment the decision feels familiar. You already know what Yamaha represents. The question is whether that reputation is still worth paying for. Ask yourself this: how much is predictability worth to you? Yamaha engines start easily, run smoothly, and feel consistent no matter who's driving or how the boat is loaded. Mid-range torque is strong, vibration is low, and long-term reliability is almost boringly good. Fuel efficiency is competitive, resale value is excellent, and dealer coverage is everywhere. You're not buying excitement, you're buying the safest choice in the room. Think of Yamaha like the default setting. Not always the cheapest, not always the fastest, but rarely the wrong answer. And once you step beyond safe, the final two brands show what premium really looks like. A Mercury 50 horsepower typically lands between 15,000 and 17,000 US dollars, and this is where things get nuanced. Mercury pricing varies widely depending on trim. tiller, remote, power trim, command thrust, and that flexibility can push prices higher fast. Here's the question: are you paying for horsepower or for configuration? Mercury gives buyers more ways to spec an engine exactly how they want it. The result is strong performance, good mid-range punch, and excellent compatibility with modern controls and rigging. Reliability is solid, dealer networks are strong, and resale remains high, but fully loaded versions can quietly become the most expensive engine in this class. Think of Mercury like a menu with too many upgrades. You get exactly what you want, but you pay for every box you tick. And when cost stops being flexible and becomes outright premium, the final brand closes the ranking. Mariner often surprises people at 50 HP because pricing can edge above Mercury in certain markets. A Mariner 50 horsepower commonly lands around $16,000 to $18,000 depending on spec and region. So here's the question: how does a brand that shares DNA with Mercury end up here? The answer is regional pricing, dealer margins, and how Mariner positions itself as a fully packaged, ready-to-go solution. Mechanically, you're getting Mercury foundations, strong performance, solid reliability, and wide service support, but pricing doesn't always reflect that familiarity. Think of Mariner like buying the same car through a different dealership. Same engine, different invoice. And that brings the ladder full circle. From the cheapest engines that simply get you moving, to premium setups where confidence, support, and specification define the price more than horsepower ever could. So before we wrap up, if you enjoy breakdowns that go beyond brochures and actually explain why engines cost what they do, subscribing just makes sure you don't miss what's coming next. And if this ranking made you rethink value versus price, the perfect follow-up is we ranked 21 engine brands from best to worst.